Jackson Reed isn't used to slowing down. As a tech CEO in the heart of New York City, his life moves at the speed of ambition. But one rainy night, something changes. Outside a closed pharmacy on 7th Avenue, he sees 3 bruised boys, triplets, huddled together, begging for help. Their eyes stop him cold. Jackson could walk away. Instead, he invites them in. One act of kindness soon unravels a hidden connection, a dangerous secret, and a corporate betrayal waiting to strike. As Jackson opens his heart, he risks everything, his empire, reputation, and freedom, for 3 boys he barely knows. But what he discovers about them, and himself, will redefine what it means to be family. Stay tuned and subscribe for more powerful, life-changing stories. The rain fell in steady sheets over Manhattan, painting the city in hues of gray and silver. Jackson Reed, CEO of ReedCore Technologies, stood at the corner of 7th Avenue, his tailored suit dampened by the downpour. The city buzzed around him, indifferent to the weather, as umbrellas bobbed and taxis splashed through puddles. He was on his way home from a late meeting, his mind occupied with quarterly reports and boardroom politics. The glow of neon signs reflected off the wet pavement, casting distorted colors that danced beneath his feet. As he passed a closed pharmacy, a soft sound caught his attention, a muffled sob barely audible over the city's hum. Turning his head, Jackson spotted 3 boys huddled together under the pharmacy's awning. They were thin, their clothes soaked and clinging to their small frames. One of them looked up, meeting Jackson's gaze with eyes that mirrored a depth of pain and resilience far beyond his years. Compelled by an instinct he couldn't explain, Jackson approached them. "Hey there," he said gently. "Are you okay?" The boys exchanged wary glances. The eldest, perhaps by mere minutes, stepped forward. "We're fine," he replied, his voice steady but guarded. Jackson crouched to their level, the rain soaking through his suit. "I'm Jackson," he offered. "Can I help you get somewhere dry?" The boys hesitated, then nodded slowly. He led them to a nearby 24-hour diner in Hell's Kitchen, the warmth and light a stark contrast to the cold streets. They settled into a booth, steam rising from their clothes as they sipped hot cocoa. Over pancakes and scrambled eggs, the boys shared their story. Their names were Liam, Aiden, and Caleb, triplets aged 10. After their mother's death, they had been left in the care of her ex-boyfriend, Troy Adams, who forced them to beg on the streets. Jackson listened intently, his heart aching with each detail. He saw in them a reflection of his own past, a childhood marred by loss and hardship. When the meal ended, Jackson hesitated before speaking. "You can stay at my place tonight," he offered. "It's safe, and you won't have to worry about Troy." The boys looked at each other, then at Jackson. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford, yet something in Jackson's demeanor reassured them. They nodded. That night, as they settled into the guest rooms of Jackson's penthouse, a sense of peace enveloped them. For the first time in a long while, they felt safe. Jackson stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker through the rain. He felt a shift within himself, a stirring of purpose beyond corporate success. The arrival of these boys had disrupted his meticulously ordered life, yet he welcomed the chaos. Unbeknownst to him, this chance encounter would unravel secrets long buried and forge bonds that would redefine the meaning of family. The bell above the door of the old diner in Hell's Kitchen jingled faintly as Jackson Reed stepped inside, rain still clinging to the back of his coat. The 3 boys followed closely, wide-eyed and silent, their oversized hoodies clinging to their bony frames. The warmth of the place hit them like a wall. Greasy air, faint doo-wop from an old jukebox, and the comforting clatter of dishes being cleared. They slid into a booth near the back, away from prying eyes. A waitress with tired eyeliner and a kind smile handed them menus, but the boys didn't even glance. They stared at the table like they were afraid it might disappear. "Order anything you want," Jackson said gently, peeling off his coat and trying to sound casual. The oldest-looking of the three, with a bruised temple and sharp blue eyes, cleared his throat. "Can we just get pancakes?" "All of you?" Jackson asked. The middle boy, freckles, nervous fingers, nodded. "And hot chocolate, please." 3 stacks and 3 hot chocolates," Jackson told the waitress, then turned back to the boys. "I'm Jackson, by the way." They exchanged a look. "I'm Liam," the oldest said, guarded. "Aiden," the middle one whispered. The youngest, who couldn't have been older than 6, mumbled, "Caleb?" Jackson smiled, then watched them carefully as they devoured the syrupy pancakes. They didn't speak, just ate, like the world might end before the plate was clean. "You said you're not runaways?" Liam swallowed hard. "We live with Troy. He used to be our mom's boyfriend. After she died, he said it was his job to take care of us, but he only wants us to beg." Aiden added, "If we don't make enough, he doesn't feed us." Jackson's heart pounded, slow and heavy. He glanced out the window, mind racing. "Where do you sleep?" "Sometimes in the van," Caleb said, staring into his cocoa. "Or at the shelter if he's drunk." "Your mother?" Jackson asked softly. "She passed away last year," Liam said. "Cancer. We were in the Bronx then." Caleb piped up. "But she used to sing us the same song every night, even when she got sick." Jackson's breath caught. "What song?" Caleb hummed a few shaky bars. It was Moon River. Jackson closed his eyes. That was Matthew's lullaby. His twin brother sang it every time he babysat Jackson's kids. A strange chill ran down his spine. "You boys ever know a Matthew Reed?" he asked, carefully. Liam nodded. "Mom said our dad's name was Matthew, but he died before we were born. He went hiking and never came back." Jackson's hands trembled under the table. A headache pulsed behind his eyes, but his voice stayed steady. "Do you have anything from him?" Aiden pulled a wrinkled shoebox from his backpack. Inside, faded photos, letters, even an old climbing glove with MR stitched in the cuff. Jackson picked up one of the pictures and nearly dropped it. There they were, Matthew and a woman he didn't recognize, arms wrapped around each other, joy etched into their young faces. The woman was unmistakably the boy's mother. He looked at the 3 faces across from him again. The same eyes, the same defiance Matthew had when he was younger. This wasn't coincidence. These were his nephews. Jackson stood slowly. "You're coming home with me tonight. No arguments." Liam looked unsure. "But Troy—" "If Troy comes near you again, I'll make sure he never hurts another child in his life." His voice wasn't angry. It was steel. Outside, the rain had stopped. Jackson opened his umbrella and led the boys to his waiting town car. As they drove uptown toward Central Park West, he glanced at their sleepy forms huddled in the back seat. He wasn't just doing this out of guilt anymore. He was doing it because family had found him again. The elevator doors opened into Jackson's penthouse, revealing a space as sleek and sterile as a museum. Glass walls, minimalist furniture, and the distant hum of city traffic below. The triplets stepped in, eyes wide, clinging to their backpacks like life vests. "Whoa," Caleb whispered, spinning slowly on the marble floor. Jackson watched them carefully, the sudden stillness in the apartment now unfamiliar. This space used to feel like a sanctuary. Now it felt incomplete until the boys stepped in. "You hungry again?" Jackson asked, unsure of how to act around children who were technically strangers, but also his family. Liam shook his head. "No, sir, we're okay." "You don't have to call me sir," Jackson said with a soft smile. "Just Jackson." The boys exchanged looks again. They seemed unsure of the rules in this new world. Jackson walked to a hallway lined with guest rooms. "You can sleep in here tonight. We'll figure everything else out in the morning." Each boy quietly picked a bed, but none climbed under the covers. "Do you have a nightlight?" Aiden asked hesitantly, fiddling with the sleeve of his hoodie. Jackson paused. "No, but—" He rummaged in a drawer and pulled out a glass sculpture shaped like a moon. It glowed faintly when he flicked it on. "Will this work?" Aiden nodded, eyes wide. "Yeah, that's perfect." Later that night, Jackson sat alone in the kitchen nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His mind was racing. Triplets, his nephews, Matthew's sons. Why hadn't anyone told him? Why had their mother kept this secret? He opened his phone and scrolled through his contacts. One name stood out. Elliot Dawson, his longtime head of security. Jackson called. "Elliot, I need you. Now." 20 minutes later, Elliot stepped into the penthouse, dressed in his usual all-black suit. He was blunt, dependable, and sharp as a tack. "I need you to dig into someone," Jackson said, sliding a piece of paper across the kitchen counter. "Troy Adams. He's been caring for the boys since their mother passed. I want to know everything, where he's been, what he's done, and if there's any blood on his hands." Elliot took the note, expression unreadable. "Understood. I'll have a report by noon. Also," Jackson added, his voice lower now, "find out if Vanessa Blake has anything to do with this." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "You think she's involved?" "I don't know. But if word gets out that I've taken in 3 boys, triplets, Vanessa will spin it into weakness. She's been circling my seat at Reed Corps for months." Elliot nodded grimly. "She's cunning, but not careful. If there's something she's hiding, I'll find it." As Elliot left, Jackson walked down the hallway and peeked into the guest room. Caleb had curled into a ball, his arm wrapped protectively around his backpack. Aiden was sitting upright, blinking at the moon lamp. Liam, the most guarded, was still awake, eyes locked on Jackson's. They stared at each other for a moment. Jackson stepped in and whispered, "You don't have to be scared anymore." Liam's voice trembled. "We've heard that before." Jackson nodded. "Then I'll show you instead." He turned off the hall light, leaving the boys under the soft glow of the moon sculpture. As he returned to his room, Jackson felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. But for the first time in years, it didn't feel like pressure. It felt like purpose. The next morning, Jackson stepped into the boys' room with a quiet knock. Sunlight streamed through the massive windows, painting golden lines across the hardwood floor. He half expected the beds to be empty, the night to feel like a dream. But there they were. Caleb still wrapped around his pillow, Aiden snoring softly, and Liam, already dressed, sitting on the edge of the bed. "You sleep okay?" Jackson asked. Liam nodded slowly. "Yeah, better than usual." Jackson smiled. "That's a start." In the kitchen, the smell of pancakes filled the air. Jackson had surprised himself by remembering how to use the griddle. He hadn't cooked in over a decade, but the moment he flipped the first pancake, it felt strangely grounding. The boys devoured breakfast like they hadn't eaten in days. "We've got a lot to figure out," Jackson said between bites. "Starting with school. You guys enrolled anywhere?" Caleb shook his head. "Troy pulled us out. Said it was easier." Easier. Jackson's stomach turned. "Well, that's changing today." He made a call to his assistant, Lauren, and within the hour had applications ready for 3 nearby charter schools. He was already clearing his calendar for the week when his phone buzzed with a message from Elliot. "You're going to want to see this." Within an hour, Jackson sat in his home office watching security footage Elliot had recovered from the penthouse building's exterior. Troy Adams, tall, furious, and impatient, stood outside the door days earlier, pacing with his phone pressed tight to his ear. "That's him?" Jackson said grimly. "He has multiple priors," Elliot confirmed. "Assault, financial fraud, CPS reports filed in the Queens and Staten Island. Never anything that stuck. He's slippery." Jackson's jaw tightened. "Can he take them?" "He's not legally related to them, but that doesn't mean he won't try." Just then, another alert lit up on Jackson's phone. An emergency board meeting had been called at Reed Corps. The sender? Vanessa Blake. Jackson leaned back, connecting the dots. "She's going for the kill," he muttered. Vanessa, his ex-business partner, had been circling the CEO role since their partnership fractured 2 years earlier. Cold, brilliant, and ruthless, she had once helped build Reed Corps from the ground up. But while Jackson's drive had always included vision, hers had always been about control. Now, with Jackson absent from meetings and suddenly responsible for 3 children, she saw blood in the water. He arrived at the skyscraper an hour later, the boys reluctantly in tow. He hadn't wanted to leave them alone. His arrival in the boardroom sparked silence. Vanessa stood at the head of the table, lips curled in a tight smile. "Jackson," she greeted coolly, "we didn't expect you to bring guests." "They're my family," he replied firmly. "Interesting," she said, turning to the board. "Mr. Reed has recently abandoned 2 board meetings and delayed a merger with our Hong Kong partner. Today, I request we vote to assign temporary operational control to preserve company stability." The boys sat quietly in the back of the room. Caleb fidgeted. Aiden looked scared. And then, amid the silence, Caleb reached for a glass paperweight on the floor, tripped, and dropped it. It shattered. Everyone turned. Jackson knelt down beside him instantly, picking up the glass carefully. "It's okay, buddy. Accidents happen." The boardroom buzzed with quiet murmurs. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. But Jackson didn't care. He stood up, glass shards in his hand, and looked around the table. "If any of you are questioning my priorities, don't. I'll step back if I have to. But I won't apologize for protecting children who've known nothing but fear." The room fell silent. Then, one board member, Claire Evans, who had known Jackson since his garage startup days, spoke quietly. "I think we've forgotten what kind of man built this company." The vote was postponed. That night, back at the penthouse, Jackson watched the boys pile onto the couch, laughing over a silly cartoon. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to laugh with them. Not as a CEO, not as a billionaire, but as something far more human. The sound of laughter still echoed faintly down the hallway as Jackson closed the door to his study, but his heart was heavy. Something about the way Vanessa had moved at the board meeting lingered like a storm cloud. He sat at his desk scrolling through his email when a notification popped up. "Urgent. Personal visit request from Troy Adams." Attached was a still image from the penthouse security camera. Troy had shown up at the building again, this time with a folder in hand. The timestamp read 2 hours ago. Elliot appeared in the doorway, reading Jackson's face. He didn't get in. Front desk didn't even buzz. But he left that file, said it was for your eyes only. Jackson opened it slowly. Inside were photos. Grainy, tabloid-style shots of him walking the boys into his building, one of Caleb crying in the boardroom, and another, taken through the glass, of Jackson comforting the child. A note was scrawled in red ink. 500K, or the press gets these. You're not a hero. You're a scandal waiting to happen. Jackson stared at the words, his hands trembling with a fury he hadn't felt in years. "He thinks I'm scared," he muttered. "He thinks you have more to lose now," Elliot said quietly. Jackson looked up, eyes fierce. "And he's right, but that doesn't mean I'll back down." Just then, a knock at the door. It was Liam, eyes wide. "Mr. Jackson! The man from the pictures! Is he coming back?" Jackson knelt beside him. "Not if I can help it. And you can call me Jackson, okay? Or—" He paused, unsure of the right word. "Or whatever feels right." Liam nodded solemnly. "Can I call you Uncle Jay?" Jackson smiled, his voice catching in his throat. "Yeah, I'd like that." By morning, Jackson had made a decision. He called his lawyer, then CPS. He would formally file for emergency guardianship. No more halfway measures. These boys needed protection, and not just from Troy. Meanwhile, Vanessa had called for another emergency board session. The memo arrived with a sting. Final vote on temporary replacement pending. Jackson's assistant Lauren texted from the office. She's stacking the room. I'd tread carefully. But Jackson wasn't planning to go to the meeting. Instead, he stood at the kitchen island packing school lunches, something he never imagined he'd do. He slipped a note into Caleb's bag. You're stronger than you think. J. Just as he finished, Caleb rushed in, holding a small, dust-covered box. We found this in one of Troy's old bags, he said breathlessly. Jackson opened it. Inside were dozens of yellowed letters. Some dated back years. One envelope had never been opened. Jackson recognized the handwriting immediately, Matthew's. His brother's neat cursive read, If anything ever happens to me, please take care of them. They're good boys, Jay. Jackson sat down hard, the room spinning. He hadn't heard from Matthew in over a year before his accident. He'd assumed the silence was distance, not a plea for help. He folded the letter gently, heart pounding with guilt and clarity. That night, he canceled his board appearance. Vanessa could win the vote if she wanted. Jackson had something far more important to fight for. Instead of facing cameras and contracts, he stood outside the family court office, documents in hand. CPS officials were waiting. So were the boys, holding on to each other, frightened but trusting. Inside, as Jackson presented the letter, the photos, and the records of Troy's abuse, the judge's expression softened. I've rarely seen someone fight this hard for children who aren't even biologically theirs, she said. But family isn't just DNA, it's action. Caleb whispered, He's ours. That's what matters. The temporary guardianship was approved. Outside the courthouse, Jackson hugged the boys tightly. This isn't the end. It's the beginning. Aiden looked up. Does this mean you're really our family? Jackson nodded, tears in his eyes. I already was. I just didn't know it yet. The morning sun filtered through the penthouse windows, casting soft gold across the boys' drawings taped to the refrigerator, stick figures labeled Liam, Aiden, Caleb, and Uncle Jay standing under a crooked sun. Jackson paused as he passed them, his hand resting gently on one crayon line that curved toward a bright red heart. It was the first day the boys would attend school with guardianship papers in place. They didn't know what that meant legally, but they knew it meant something safe, something steady. As the boys left with their new backpacks and cautious smiles, Jackson turned to Elliot, his longtime head of security. We need answers about Matthew, he said quietly. I need to know what he was running from. Elliot nodded. Already started digging, but there's something else. He handed Jackson a slim folder. Inside were images from the shoebox the boys had found in Troy's duffel bag. Letters, legal notes, birth documents. One stood out, a hospital form listing Matthew Reed as father of child, Triplets. No mother's name, no address. Another sheet had a familiar stamp, CPS, closed case file. Jackson's gut twisted. Why would CPS close a case without notifying me? Elliot hesitated. The reports were filed under a different last name. The mother used Danvers, probably to avoid media or legal scrutiny. Your name was never mentioned. But Matthew, he knew, Jackson whispered. Looks like he was trying to shield them, Elliot said. From Troy. From you, maybe. From everything. The next call Jackson made was to the hospital in Poughkeepsie where the birth records had originated. After a few tense minutes of legal confirmation and identity checks, a sympathetic nurse confirmed. Yes, triplets were born to Anna Danvers and Matthew Reed nearly a decade ago. Anna had died shortly after childbirth from complications. The boys had bounced between short-term foster care and Matthew, who had no formal custody but had returned for them, until his death 2 years later. And then, Troy had stepped in. Jackson stared out at Central Park, the sky dimming now with the weight of everything he didn't know. They're not just my nephews. They're what's left of him. Later that afternoon, Jackson sat the boys down in the living room. They sat cross-legged on the carpet, watching him with quiet, expectant eyes. "There's something I need to tell you," Jackson began, his voice gentle but firm. "I know who your real dad was." Aiden blinked. "You're not?" Jackson shook his head. "No, your dad was my twin brother, Matthew." There was a pause. Then Liam asked, "Does that make you our uncle?" "I am your uncle, but if you want me to be something more, I'm here for that too." Caleb looked down at his lap, then whispered, "He's gone, isn't he?" Jackson nodded slowly. "He loved you very much. He tried to protect you." Aiden's eyes welled. "I don't even remember his face." Jackson stood and returned with a small leather-bound photo album. "You don't have to. I've got hundreds of pictures and stories, and I've got his laugh." He chuckled, soft and low, and the boys leaned in. That night, as Jackson tucked them in, Liam clutched his hand. "Does this mean we get to stay here forever?" Jackson's throat tightened. "It means I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure of it." Across town, however, someone else was watching. Vanessa Blake leaned back in her chair at a Reed Corps HQ, tapping her manicured nails against a glossy printout. Photos of Jackson with the boys at the courthouse. Her eyes narrowed. She picked up her phone and dialed. "This is Blake. Trigger the CPS complaint. Use the angle about instability. Mention trauma, unsupervised minors, and media exposure. Make it stick." The person on the other end hesitated. "Won't that be obvious?" She smiled coldly. "It just needs to be believable. The board won't wait forever. Let's remind them what poor judgment looks like." Back at the penthouse, Jackson didn't know that the next battle was already quietly brewing. But for now, he sat by the window, watching the stars with Caleb on his lap. "Do you think Dad can see us?" Caleb asked. "I hope so," Jackson said softly, "and I hope he's proud." By Monday morning, the cozy warmth of Jackson's penthouse felt like a fragile bubble, one built on bedtime stories, pancakes, and the promise of permanence. But outside that bubble, trouble had started to swirl. The knock on the door came at 8:14 a.m., sharp. Jackson opened it to find two women standing side by side. One wore a muted gray blazer and held a clipboard. The other had a gentle smile, but her eyes scanned the apartment quickly, calculating. "Mr. Reed?" the woman in gray asked. "Yes." "I'm Alyssa Parks. This is my associate, Maribel Grant. We're with New York City Child Protective Services. We received an anonymous tip regarding 3 minors in your care." Jackson didn't flinch, but his heart thudded in his chest. "May I ask what kind of tip?" Alyssa's tone stayed neutral. "Claims of emotional instability, potential media exploitation, and inadequate supervision. Standard procedure. We're here to assess safety." "Of course," Jackson said. "The boys are getting ready for school. You're welcome to speak with them after I call my attorney." He kept his voice calm, measured. But inside, fury was rising. He didn't need a map to know who had sent them. Vanessa Blake was many things. Vindictive, relentless, but subtle was not one of them. Within 20 minutes, Jackson's attorney, Leslie Wu, had joined them in the living room. She was brilliant, fiercely composed, and no stranger to high-profile custody cases. With her present, CPS conducted interviews, inspected bedrooms, reviewed the boys' medical files, and noted Jackson's new legal guardianship documents. "I'm sorry this is happening," Maribel said softly on her way out. "It's clear you care deeply for these children." "Someone's trying to sabotage this," Jackson said under his breath. Maribel nodded. We've seen that before. We'll document everything fairly. After they left, Jackson sat alone for a while, staring at the crayon drawing taped to the fridge. The little heart in the corner now felt like both an anchor and a target. That night, as the boys played chess and made up stories about alien dinosaurs, Jackson stepped into his office and called Elliot. "She's playing dirty," he said. "We need leverage. Find something real on Vanessa, something that will shut her down, completely." Elliot didn't hesitate. "Already working on it." 2 days later, a familiar face appeared at the Reed Corps boardroom entrance. Vanessa Blake, dressed in the signature crimson, holding a fresh round of performance analytics and a smug grin. "As acting CEO," she began, "I'd like to highlight declining market confidence over the last 2 weeks, likely due to our founder's erratic behavior." Jackson stood from his seat at the far end of the long glass table. "Before we get into quarterly projections," he said evenly, "I'd like to introduce an addendum to today's agenda." He handed folders to each board member. Inside were records Elliot had uncovered. Vanessa had used company funds to charter private flights, hire personal image consultants, and funnel bonuses to Shell staff listed under fake names. "This is embezzlement," Jackson said. "At best. At worst, it's a systematic betrayal of shareholder trust." The room fell silent. Vanessa's expression cracked, just for a second. One board member cleared his throat. "Ms. Blake, is this accurate?" She stammered. "These are exaggerations, fabrications." Jackson raised a brow. "Then I assume you'll have no problem with a full forensic audit?" That did it. The vote to remove her from operational control passed unanimously. Jackson didn't smile. He simply gathered his papers, nodded, and walked out. Back home, the boys greeted him with hugs and a mess of popcorn on the floor. "Guess what, Uncle Jay?" Caleb grinned. "We had a class vote today. Aiden's story won." "Oh yeah?" Jackson ruffled his hair. "It was about a family made of people who didn't look the same, but they still fit together, like puzzle pieces." Jackson swallowed hard. "Sounds like the best kind of family to me." He tucked them in that night with an extra blanket and lingered at the door just a moment longer. The storm hadn't passed, but for the first time in years, he had something real worth weathering it for. 3 days after Vanessa's removal from Reed Corps' executive branch, calm returned to the boardroom, but not to Jackson Reed's heart. At home, the triplets were thriving. Liam's jokes were getting sharper, Aiden was building a Lego fortress on the balcony, and Caleb had taken to calling Jackson Uncle Jay with increasing affection. But one nagging thought still lived in Jackson's mind. If the boys weren't just lost kids, if they were connected to Matthew, his late twin, then the stakes were even higher. The boys deserved truth, and if that truth proved they were Reed blood, then Jackson wasn't just their protector, he was their family. "Run the test," he told Elliot late one night. "Quietly. I need to know." Elliot nodded. "We'll use the hair from Caleb's old beanie you saved." 2 days later, the results arrived in a sealed folder. Jackson opened it slowly, heart pounding like a drum in his chest. Positive. Paternity, 99.98%, matched to Matthew Reed. The air left his lungs in one long, aching exhale. These weren't just boys he'd taken in. They were his nephews, and somehow Matthew had never told him why. He dialed his old college roommate, Scott Torres, who'd also been Matthew's closest climbing partner. Scott answered on the second ring. "Jackson, it's been years, man. I know. I need to ask something. Personal. Did Matthew ever mention a woman, someone he saw briefly before the accident? Maybe out west?" Scott paused. "Yeah. Her name was Claire. Met her on a trip to Oregon. Said it got serious fast, but they fought before he came back. He never got the chance to fix it." Jackson nodded slowly. "Did she know he died?" I don't know. After the funeral, no one talked about her again. That night, Jackson stood at the window of the penthouse, staring out over Central Park. It all made sense now. Claire had gone through the pregnancy alone. Matthew hadn't known. And when she passed away, Troy, the leech, must have taken the boys to exploit them. He turned to find Caleb watching him from the hallway, silent in his dinosaur pajamas. "Can't sleep?" Jackson asked softly. Caleb shook his head. "Did I do something wrong?" Jackson bent down, gently placing both hands on the boy's shoulders. "No, buddy. You didn't do anything wrong, but there's something important I need to tell you about your mom and your real dad." The next morning, he sat the triplets down at the breakfast table, pancakes untouched in front of them. "You know how I told you I'd always be honest?" he began. 3 small heads nodded. "Well, I found out that your real father was my brother, my twin." They stared, blinking, mouths open in surprise. "You mean, we're your nephews?" Liam asked. Jackson smiled sadly. "Yeah, you are. And I think you've always been part of my heart, even before I knew it." Aiden clutched his fork tightly. "Does that mean you'll send us away?" Jackson's voice cracked. "No, never. I'm your family now. For real." Later that afternoon, the boys asked if they could visit their father's resting place. With help from Elliot and the private investigator, Jackson tracked down the unmarked grave in a Portland cemetery. He flew the boys there personally. No press, no suits, just 4 people, 3 children, and a man still grieving the brother he never really said goodbye to. At the grave, Caleb placed a paper drawing on the headstone. 4 stick figures holding hands. One had spiky hair, labeled Uncle J. Another had angel wings, Dad. Jackson knelt beside the boys. "He would have loved you all, so much. And he picked you," Aiden said softly, "to find us." The words hit like a punch to the chest. "I think maybe he did," Jackson whispered. As they left, Caleb tugged on Jackson's coat. "We're not going anywhere, right?" Jackson knelt, hugged him tightly. "You're home, and this time no one's taking that away." Jackson's return to New York was meant to be quiet. But nothing stayed quiet for long. Not when you were a billionaire CEO who had just publicly reclaimed 3 children from an abuser and shaken up the corporate power structure of a Fortune 100 company. And especially not when the story involved blood ties, adoption filings, and former board members eager to reclaim lost power. One morning, as Jackson poured cereal for the boys, who now called him Uncle J, like it was the most natural title in the world, his phone lit up with a notification from his legal team. "Child Protective Services has opened an investigation. Anonymous complaint filed." He froze. Mid-pour, milk overflowed the bowl and pooled onto the counter. His heart thudded. He knew exactly who had done it, Vanessa. He had underestimated how far she'd go to keep a grudge alive. The report accused Jackson of exploiting the boys for positive press, claiming their appearance during the board saga had been performative and emotionally unsafe. The complaint referenced unvetted travel, emotional instability, and, most disturbingly, use of children for leverage in corporate settings. He reread the words, rage and fear competing in his chest. It was calculated, cold, effective. And it could destroy everything. Within the hour, a CPS caseworker named Angela Monroe arrived at the penthouse. She was firm but respectful, explaining that the agency was required to follow up on credible tips. Jackson cooperated fully. He gave her access to the boys' school records, medical files, and emotional assessments completed by child therapists, appointments he'd arranged himself. But the moment that twisted his gut, the hardest, came when she asked to speak to each boy individually. What if I say the wrong thing? Caleb whispered to him. There's no wrong thing, Jackson said, kneeling. Just speak your truth. Be yourself. That's more than enough. The boys handled the interviews bravely. When Angela emerged from her final chat with Aiden, her face had softened. They clearly love you, she said. That's not in question. But this process has to run its course. We'll need to verify everything. As she left, Jackson turned back toward the apartment, now painfully aware of how fragile his new world was, how one accusation could bring it all crashing down. Later that night, he called Evan, the boy's biological father, now estranged but still legally relevant. I need you to know what's happening, Jackson said, and if CPS reaches out, I'd like your support. There was a long pause on the other end. You think I'd side with Vanessa? Evan finally said. Jackson was silent. Evan sighed. You've done more for those boys in months than I did in years. I won't sabotage that. Thank you, Jackson replied, the words barely audible. I'm not a saint, Jackson, Evan added, but I've seen enough to know they're safe with you. I'll tell CPS the truth. For the next 2 weeks, Jackson walked on eggshells. Every phone call made him flinch. Every knock at the door felt like it could be the one that unraveled their lives. The boys noticed the tension and responded in their own way, clinging tighter, whispering more, asking fewer questions but watching his every move. Then came the letter. After thorough investigation, no grounds for concern have been found. Case closed. Jackson exhaled so deeply he nearly collapsed. That night, the boys threw a no more interviews party in the living room, complete with paper crowns and microwave popcorn. Aiden performed a breakdance routine. Caleb gave Jackson a drawing of them standing together with shields, labeled Family Defense Force. As Jackson tucked them into bed, Caleb turned to him and asked, Uncle Jay, are we really safe now? Jackson nodded, voice thick. As long as I'm breathing, you're safe. But deep down, he knew that loving them came with a price he'd pay 1,000 times over, because the world might throw everything it had at them, but they'd face it together. And this time, Jackson wouldn't run. He'd fight, with every last breath. The days after the CPS case closed should have been filled with peace, but peace never lingered long in Jackson Reed's world. Not when life had other plans. It started with Caleb sleeping more than usual. Then came the bruises. Small, odd ones that didn't make sense for a child who hadn't fallen. When he fainted during recess at school, Jackson's heart cracked open in full panic. They rushed to Mount Sinai Hospital. Jackson didn't leave Caleb's side for a second as the tests dragged on. Hours turned into a night. A soft-spoken pediatric oncologist finally entered the room, her eyes careful but clear. It's severe aplastic anemia, she said gently. Caleb's bone marrow isn't producing enough blood cells. We need to act fast. Jackson felt like the floor gave out beneath him. The doctor continued, explaining that they'd start with transfusions, but Caleb would need a bone marrow transplant to survive long-term. The problem? His brothers weren't matches. The weeks that followed blurred into clinic visits, specialist meetings, and tissue testing. Caleb's energy waned. His laugh, once loud and bright, was now soft, tired. Jackson, usually composed and relentless in the face of crisis, found himself quietly breaking in elevators and hospital bathrooms. One night, he stood alone in the hospital chapel, his palms pressed together, elbows shaking. He wasn't religious, but he was desperate. "Give me the sickness," he whispered. "Give me the pain. Just don't let him go." Then came the call from the lab. Because Jackson and his twin brother Matthew had been identical, there was a near-perfect chance Jackson's marrow would be a viable match. It was the first time Jackson cried from hope. The day of the transplant, Jackson lay on one hospital bed, Caleb on another. A wall separated them, but the moment felt like they were side by side, connected not by blood, but by love sharpened into sacrifice. The procedure was painful, recovery even more so, but Jackson never once complained. Not when the aches spread through his limbs like fire, not when the fever hit. Because across the hall, Caleb was fighting harder than anyone ever should at his age. Emily, the nurse assigned to their wing, said quietly, "I've never seen a child with that much spirit, or a man with that much resolve." Weeks passed. Then came the numbers. Better blood counts, signs of healthy marrow, little glimmers of hope. The day Caleb stood up unassisted for the first time, the entire floor clapped. Jackson scooped him into his arms, holding him like he might never let go. Later that night, Liam and Aiden curled into Jackson's side as they watched a movie. Caleb sat nestled on his lap, holding the same drawing he once made. Family Defense Force. "You're our shield," Aiden whispered. Jackson kissed the tops of their heads. "No," he said softly, "you're mine." Outside the hospital, the media buzzed. News had leaked about the transplant. Questions poured in from the business world about Reed Corps' future, Jackson's leadership, his priorities. His answer came days later at a televised press conference. Jackson stood at the podium, not in a designer suit, but in a simple gray sweater, his eyes still tired from hospital nights. "I missed a few earnings calls," he began, "because I was making sure my son didn't die." He looked out at the cameras. "Let that be the legacy of this company. Not profit over people, not image over truth, but family first. Always." The reporters froze, unsure how to respond. But inside homes across the country, parents nodded. Grandparents wept. Children leaned in. And 3 boys, safe in a hospital room lit by soft fairy lights, watched their dad take a stand that mattered more than money ever could. The courthouse in downtown Manhattan was quiet that morning, despite the press gathered just beyond its marble steps. Inside, the mood was thick with anticipation, like the air before a storm. Jackson Reed sat beside Liam, Aiden, and Caleb on a wooden bench polished by years of waiting. Caleb clutched a toy space shuttle in one hand and Jackson's fingers in the other. His eyes still looked tired, but the shadows under them had begun to fade. The courtroom doors creaked open. "Mr. Reed," the clerk called, "they're ready for you." Inside, Judge Ramirez, stern but fair, glanced over her glasses as the case file landed on her desk. "This is the final step," she said, glancing between Jackson and the boys. "I've reviewed the documentation, including the emergency guardianship, medical history, DNA confirmations, and letters of support. But I'd like to hear one thing. Why do you want to adopt these children?" Jackson stood, heart thudding in his chest. He didn't prepare a speech. He just spoke from the place that had transformed since 3 boys entered his life. "I used to think legacy was something you built with code, capital, and control," he began softly. "I thought my brother Matthew and I shared that vision. Until I lost him, and then I thought I had nothing left." He looked at the boys, who now sat wide-eyed, hanging on every word. "But the day I found them, his sons, I found him again. Not in memory, in movement, in laughter, in stubbornness and curiosity and love." He paused. His voice caught, and I realized, family isn't something you plan. It's something you answer when it calls. The room was silent. Judge Ramirez cleared her throat. "Mr. Reed, thank you. This court recognizes the sincerity of your guardianship and affirms the best interests of the children." She signed the final page. "Effective immediately, Liam, Aiden, and Caleb are adopted as your legal sons. Congratulations." Caleb dropped the shuttle and squealed. Aiden hugged his brother. Liam beamed. Jackson didn't say a word. He just pulled all 3 into his arms, burying his face into the space between their shoulders. For once, no boardroom, no title, no crowd could interrupt this moment. He was just Dad. Outside, the press cameras fired. Reporters shouted questions. Jackson shielded the boys with his arms, whispered, "Not today," and walked them straight to a waiting SUV. Back home, the penthouse wasn't just their temporary shelter anymore. It was theirs. The boys' names were etched on hooks by the door. Their drawings covered the fridge, and their laughter, now freer and louder than ever, filled the high ceilings. That evening, as the sun sank over Central Park, Emily, their caseworker, arrived unexpectedly, holding an envelope in her hands. "It was sent to our office last week," she said. "I think it's from someone connected to their past." Jackson took it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable. Matthew Reed. Inside was a letter, old, postmarked nearly 9 years ago. It had likely been lost or misfiled. He read it silently, then again, then aloud. "If something ever happens to me, and the boys are still out there, don't leave them wondering who loved them. I always hoped you'd find them, Jackson. You have more heart than you let the world see. Let them see it. Let them know they were never forgotten." His hands trembled slightly as he folded it back. The boys watched, confused. "Who was that from?" Aiden asked. Jackson smiled through glassy eyes. "It was from your dad, my brother, and he would have been proud of you." That night, the boys curled into bed with extra blankets, too full of joy to sleep. Jackson sat nearby, reading them the last page of a story they'd started weeks ago. As he closed the book, Caleb whispered, "Thanks for choosing us." Jackson leaned in and kissed his forehead. "I didn't choose you," he said. "You were already mine. I just hadn't found you yet." 2 years later, the world outside the Reed Corps Tower had changed, but inside the penthouse that overlooked Central Park, the change was even more profound. It was Saturday morning. The kitchen buzzed with activity. Pancakes flipped in the skillet while Aiden scrambled eggs and Liam carefully poured orange juice into 3 tall glasses. Caleb, now healthier and stronger, danced in his socks on the marble floor, singing off-key to a cartoon theme song. Jackson watched from the hallway, arms crossed, quietly taking in the scene. No tie, no phone, no meeting agenda, just life. "Breakfast is ready, Papa!" Caleb yelled joyfully. Jackson walked in and scooped him up, spinning him once. "Smells like a 5-star meal." "It's a special day," Liam announced proudly. "We're planting Uncle Matthew's garden today." They'd been preparing all week. With help from the Foundation's volunteers, they'd set aside a plot at the new Reed Family Center, a child development facility Jackson had funded in his brother's name. It would include therapy rooms, after-school support, and housing for at-risk kids. At the center of it all, a garden of white lilies, Matthew's favorite flower. Later that afternoon, they stood at the garden site, sunlight casting golden streaks across the earth. Jackson handed each of the boys a small lily bulb. "These are for the kids still waiting to be found." They nodded solemnly and began planting, their small hands careful and steady. Beside them, a plaque shimmered in the light. "The Matthew Reed Garden. May every child feel seen, safe, and deeply loved." The crowd behind them, filled with foster parents, city officials, and families like theirs, began to applaud softly. Later that evening, Jackson tucked the boys into bed, just like he always did now. Caleb clutched his space shuttle. "Papa?" "Yeah, buddy?" "Do you think Uncle Matthew can see us?" Jackson ran a hand through his hair and exhaled slowly. "I think he never stopped." The room fell quiet, bathed in soft amber light. Jackson stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the warmth inside. A voice called from behind. "You're becoming who he always believed you were." Jackson turned. It was Emily, the former CPS caseworker, now a close friend and director of family services at the foundation. She smiled warmly. "I never imagined I'd build a legacy like this," Jackson said quietly. Emily shook her head. "This isn't about legacy. It's about love. That's what changes the world." A pause. Jackson nodded. Back in his office, he sat at his desk and pulled out an old framed photo of Matthew. He placed it next to a new one. The boys, covered in dirt, beaming in front of the freshly planted garden. He smiled. That night, he updated the Reed Corps mission statement online. "We are not here to dominate markets. We are here to serve people. Innovation with heart, growth with grace, family first." Jackson Reed, CEO and father across the city, screens flickered with the updated homepage. But inside the penthouse, the only light that mattered came from 3 nightlights shaped like stars. Jackson stood at the window, staring at the skyline. He'd gained boardrooms and lost them, built empires and seen them crumble, but none of it compared to the steady beat of 3 hearts that now depended on his. He didn't just find a family. He became one.